G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant weekend. And a massive thank you to all of those that have reached out to me wishing me luck with my 8th round of chemotherapy that I begin this evening, or at least straight after this video is complete. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. Of course, we will be looking at the maps, comparing maps, showing movements, confirming that with geolocations and opposing sides of maps. But on that, we're going to look at Pokrovsk. The situation is deteriorating, and something we have been speaking about for some time is what we refer to as the paint by numbers method of how Russia is taking towns to cities. And we've spoken about this again and again of weapons used to hold, to envelop, to destroy. And we have been speaking about a weapons system, of course, a multiple launch rocket system with thermobaric warheads, TOS. We have been saying when we see that enter the fold, that tells us a lot about the next steps. And today is the day that we are seeing that used around Pokrovsk. And we're going to do a deep dive in Pokrovsk and the movements and how this can be catastrophic for other areas in the Donbass and setting up other areas to envelop, to fall to a trit. We're going to talk about tariffs. We're going to look in, is it realistic that Trump is going to apply massive tariffs to Russian oil, Russian products, and not just to Russia, but to countries that are buying those products, from China to Indian crude, that import? Realistically, is that going to happen? We know there was an ultimatum given by Mr. Trump of 50 days. We're down into the low 30 days now. And what's going to happen when that ultimatum expires? We'll speak more about that. And we're going to speak about then drones, salaries, corruption, and that is where we're going to start, as many are holding their breath for a very large drone attack expected in the coming days. So Vitaly, or at Monsters with a 0 instead of an O, he releases these graphs following Iran drone attacks, and they're very, very helpful and very accurate also. So what we get is we have 4 or 5 days and then we get a large spike in a large attack. And as we can see, over the past month, we have had record attack on record attack. And you can see where I've mapped out with my red lines in here, that flat and then the huge spike. And over the past 4 days, we have been in one of these flat lines. So it is expected tonight, tomorrow night, or at least in the coming days, we could see a record wave of Iran and Iran decoy drones in the air towards Ukraine. And we do know the more of those get fired with the updated variants too, the larger impact and destruction that they are causing, as Russia's manufacturing of those has absolutely skyrocketed. And not just manufacturing, but with improvements as well that are negating some of the air defense systems as far as the machine guns, Gepards against those as well. So wait out on that. We'll talk about the effect. Speaking of drones, we see this. Ukraine's 23rd Mech Brigade training to shoot down UAVs, drones with shotguns and clay skeet, which is a very good idea. But like motorcycle attacks or light vehicle attacks, everyone said when Russia was using shotguns, it was a sign of Russia failing. It was cope. It was useless. And what I will say as a former infantryman, shotguns are absolutely not useless. When I was in Afghanistan was really before massive drone threat, but there was still some level of drone threat, nowhere near to the complexity that we see now. But we had Remington 700s in case of that, of shotguns. And those that say it is useless, well, please tell me a better way to counter these for as cheap. And please tell me, because I'll invest and you and I will become billionaires together. There is no cheap, effective solution against drones. And I'm not saying that shotguns are by any means a solution, but those that are saying it is useless, it is cope, whatever, would you rather roll out with your boys with nothing or with a weapon system that we have seen successfully engage drones before? So I think that sort of training is very, very useful. So let's have a look at this. And much of the world's media is reporting this today. Zelensky plans to ask Europe to help pay Ukraine's soldiers. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky plans to ask European allies to help finance improved salaries for troops resisting Russia's invasion in a bid to ease growing shortages of recruits. We know that Ukraine has very, very little recruitment at the moment, and although the mainstream media will not show it and pages will not talk about it, pages that say they are for the Ukrainian people will not show men physically getting nabbed off the street to get sent to the front line against their will. Ukraine is having a huge problem, a manpower catastrophe, as Deep State put it at the moment. Previously, Europeans refused to provide funding for the salaries of our military personnel, only for weapons from Zelensky. Our service members themselves can be the weapon that protects everyone. And saying, therefore, Europe should pay more. From further down the article, while the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is providing a loan program worth about $16 billion, is urging Kyiv to shrink the budget gap. The government has no plans to raise taxes. Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia told Bloomberg News in an interview, global donors have earmarked only half of the estimated $75 billion needed for the budget over the next 2 years. And we see the government, Ukraine, has no plans to raise taxes. Ukraine has a flat tax rate of 18%, which is very, very low, especially when compared to its allies of Australia, America, or especially in Europe, and has not lifted this and has no plans to lift this. Now, I, like everyone who works for their money, hate taxes, but in time of war like this is how you make more money, especially if it's much, much lower than those countries supporting you. And what I think Ukraine should do, and what I believe is the right thing to do as well, is not just rely on outside money, is lift the tax rate. This doesn't mean it will affect 99% of the population. Keep that the same. But lift it for high income earners and lift it in line with European standards. For France, above 180,000 euros is 45%. So you will then tax Ukrainian oligarchs, Ukrainian bloggers, OnlyFans girls who use the war of, hey, this is my school, while your next fucking photograph on Instagram is you driving a Porsche in Dubai. You should not be paying 18% tax. I don't see how that is not seen as a reasonable solution to this when the people funding this in Europe, they're paying 45%. All these people, the bloggers that have fled, the bloggers earning millions off this war, the OnlyFans earning millions off this war, the oligarchs, they are paying then this 18%, especially those that have left the country. And it would not affect at all those who are vulnerable in the lower and middle class. I don't see how that is not seen to at all. But also, releasing this in the days following Zelensky's infamous crackdown on his anti-corruption agencies, this is not fantastic timing to be asking for much, much more money while not making any changes internally to raise more money. Although, will this actually work? Well, I'm not confident in this because more money, but we know the situation on the front line at the moment and the credibility loss that Zelensky has had as well. And we see the Australian Army has incredibly high wages, so does the Canadian Army, and a lot of Western militaries have high wages as well. But Canada, Australia are leaders here, and we, in peacetime, with no chance of you going to war and dying right now, you never know in the future, but in peacetime with really good conditions, with really good pay, we still have a absolute recruiting shortage. We cannot get people. So I don't know if this will be a fix-all to the problem. So let's talk more about that corruption because this isn't great timing. Zelensky's MPs, members of parliament, balk at restoring anti-corruption bodies over revenge fears. So this is a large problem, and Zelensky here may have dug his own grave. Scores of Volodymyr Zelensky's MPs are potentially refusing to vote to restore the independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies, fearing the regained powers will be used by prosecutors to take revenge against them. I don't know if it would only be to take revenge. It might actually just be to then expose corruption. According to three people close to Ukraine's leader, as many as 70 MPs from the ruling Servant of the People's Party have signalled their unease with the measure, which rolls back a bill hastily pushed through Parliament on Tuesday. The holdouts may put in jeopardy Zelensky's efforts to undo a bill, widely criticised by Ukraine's allies and civil society, people protesting on the streets. That subordinated the country's main anti-corruption agencies under the Prosecutor General chosen by the president. So now that Zelensky's done it, switch it back, needs to go through then the government, and leaders may go, well, there may be revenge on us, or maybe there's not going to be revenge. Maybe these anti-corruption agencies are just going to have more of a fire under their ass to actually expose corruption too. The article continues. People are scared to be unjustly prosecuted as a revenge, one of the top managers of Zelensky's parliamentary faction. Parliament Speaker Ruslan Stefanchuk said on Friday that a new bill would be considered during a session on July 31. But given the doubts over MPs backing the legislation, it may be delayed or tabled at a time when there are too few MPs present to pass it. And again, you don't know the speculation, but maybe they knew this was never going to get turned back. Zelensky said the revised bill included new provisions aimed at protecting against influence by Russian spy agencies. And it just seems Europe-wide, from Paris to Kyiv, as soon as something goes through that you don't like, you cite Russian influence, whether it is there or not, or whether it is so minimal it's not actually interfering in anything. You cite that and everything can get thrown out. Primarily in response to cases involving certain representatives of NABU, one of these anti-corruption agencies. What Zelensky has put forward is it calls for employees of all law enforcement agencies, including the NABU, who have relatives originating from or residing in Russia to undergo polygraph tests every 2 years. Polygraph tests don't have the greatest track record when it comes to this. But also what this is doing is it is still putting restrictions on these anti-corruption agencies, and by citing Russian interference, which there is nothing written down of what is Russian interference. If a Russian bloke online says, hey, I think that guy's corrupt, and then NABU goes, hey, I think that guy's corrupt, even if he is that enough to say, well, there was interference in that, and then we're going to put all of our weight on you? Again, huge problems while you're asking for significantly in the tens of billions of dollars more money while refusing to raise taxes or lower conscription because of manpower shortages. And this is the paradox of existential war. This war is existential for Ukraine, but they're refusing to conscript lower because they say that's existential if those men get sent and die on the front line, and refusing to raise taxes as well on politicians, oligarchs, OnlyFans, bloggers who earn hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars off this war. Let's talk about Pokrovsk. And we'll jump onto the maps. Of course, here is Ukraine in the centre of the screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014, red check ground that Russia has made over 24 hours, blue check Ukraine regained territory in 24 hours. But the area we're going to focus on for the next, say, 10 minutes is Pokrovsk down in here, that is enveloped by the Russian forces, and routes in and out are under heavy Russian fire, from drones to FABs to many different types of offensive weapons, causing a huge problem at the moment, and then exploiting attritional warfare. I got sent this across from Davo on my Telegram, Willie OAM Real. If you'd like to come and join, there's also a link down below. And he commented this. Remember, Willie, the toupee fallacy. You put just the definition from AI. The toupee fallacy is a type of selection bias where a judgment about a whole category is made based on noticeable, often negative examples while overlooking less obvious, high-quality instances. And this goes well in line with what we speak about when we speak about the public opinion Walter Lippmann pseudo-environment. You focus on one thing while leaving out others, so it's still true within that environment. The name comes from the observation that poorly made toupees are easily spotted, leading to the incorrect generalisation that all toupees look bad, even though many convincing ones exist, but they go unnoticed. And Davo writes this: I often wonder when Russian soldiers capture a position, the usual assumption is meat wave attacks, huge losses, every step forward is bathed in blood. And certainly there is an abundance of drone footage showing failed attacks. Once again, the toupee fallacy, because we know not all of these attacks have failed, otherwise the line wouldn't move. But every time the Ukrainians capture a position, the assumption suddenly switches to super, mega, ultra, delta, Ranger SAS operators in green berets using sophisticated NATO training, tactics and equipment to take the Russian conscripts by surprise and wipe them out with minimum losses. And there's a lot to unpack here. But it gets me thinking, if the Russians are taking enormous losses in their advances, whilst having then the more artillery, more drones on the front line, and also then areas of which they are enveloping, then how colossal are the Ukrainian losses in their counterattacks? Sort of like a reverse toupee fallacy. We only hear about the ones that succeed. And I'd like to add a quote in here. Narratives built on selective evidence are not intelligence assessments. They are PR campaigns. Conclusion. If Pokrovsk falls, it would be the loss of the small but important regional city that will hurt. What will hurt will be the wasteful counterattacks to hold the city at all costs and continue feeding in here currently while it is enveloped. All while the media says, aha, you see, another successful trap for the Russians set by the armed forces of Ukraine, just like Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Again, there's a lot to unpack here, but we see the toupee fallacy. And as I'll say, in attritional war, the real damage is often done before we see a movement on the maps. So what was I speaking about in the beginning of a weapon system that has entered the battlefield that tells me a lot about the next steps? Well, here we have Pokrovsk, and I'll show you this footage. This is down in the southern region. I'll show you the geolocation in a second, and this is how we have geolocated this. We have multiple launch rocket system, then thermobaric warheads landing here. And why are thermobarics so devastating? Well, they don't have the sheer destructive power of a 100, 200 to 500 kilogram fab glide bomb. They don't have that breakthrough destructive energy. But the way that these work are incredibly effective and incredibly efficient against underground facilities, dug in areas and buildings due to being thermobaric. And this is the geolocation of where these landed. And this is a bad sign. And this goes into the paint by numbers or the triple choke that people will talk about of Russian strategy. So what they're doing, and has worked again and again successfully, and Ukraine has shown that they've got no way to stop this, is they build the flanks. Then they control the routes in and out, continuing to build that flank to pour in Ukrainian soldiers in here as the attritional warfare is the sort of war that we are in at the moment. Territory is only a byproduct of attrition. Then, in the center of Pokrovsk, you use drones to hold forces in here. Drones won't punch through bunkers, underground areas, massively dug in positions, but it can hold there. You're static. Then Russia uses 250, 500, 3-ton fab glide bombs to smash through and destroy those areas. Then, to create chaos in areas, you have DRG, recon sabotage elements, move forward in here, and we've seen that cause a lot of blue on blue, a lot of confusion of the soldiers as well, and of course reconnaissance for movement in and out, working with drones. And then once the drones have held in place, the fabs have destroyed areas. Those fabs aren't going to travel down underground as something like a TOS will for cleanup of positions and the final step in major assaults that we see, and then we see larger armoured or infantry movements following that, holding in place by drones, picking off reconnaissance, smash through with fabs, and then clean up with TOS. And I said only a few days ago, once we see TOS in here, this tells us a hell of a lot. So let's have a look at the maps. Now, no changes yesterday. Then we step up to today and we don't see major changes, but we do see just some red check around Mira Lubivkia as well. But this is still behind where we know the map is sitting by some geolocations. So we have these geolocations here. We have 3 flags going up near Novu-Kenomechny, and you see at these positions at 50 seconds, 124 and 142. So I'll just show you this footage in here. So we have this is the 124 one. Then we go back. This is at the, go back. At 50 seconds, we see a flag going up, and then 142, we have the other flag right there. So we can confirm those geolocations, and likely that this area has become red overnight, as per the maps showed us yesterday. Let's have a look at then Suryak maps. He is showing, as per the geolocations that we have seen, and more ground being made on the eastern side of this around Yamblanivkia, as per the geolocations that we had seen as well. Then he had a second update here as well, showing further exploitation on the northwestern side of this, and this is the area that does concern us the most. Murilubivki, the bottom of the pocket that has formed, that is the weakest positions, as it's the most stretched out logistics routes. But we can see this Narkanarivkia, and where Suryak is showing from Pankivkia, Mayak, with this grey zone on the deep state, and where this is saying it is red zone at the moment, coming through the Tetacons and the reservoirs in here, that all this area is getting filled in red, at least by Suryak map, and shows more movement just to the west of Toretsk. So massively fattening this area at the moment. We'll talk about more of that in a sec, and how this is becoming more and more of an issue. We have one more map for you, then we'll focus on this eastern side as well. So in Zerove, down in here, Suryak map, he shows this, that there's more ground being made into Chernishny, as well as through Zerove in Persho-Travneve, where we have seen DRG elements working in Pokrovsk. There are Russian pages suggesting today, or saying, that there has been more teams enter Pokrovsk. There has been some what appears to be fabricated footage as well. But let's talk about this area in here, and why this is not only catastrophic for Pokrovsk, but more areas through Dobropilia, and ultimately Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and larger frontline movements. So Vitaly again says this, and this is the exact area we're talking about. Remember, the Russian drone pilots from Kursk, who paralysed the AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine's logistics, were later moved to Pokrovsk. So the drone pilots who caused that chaos up there, they were moved to Pokrovsk. And what chaos got caused? Well, the way they caused chaos was with fibre optics at the time and vertical envelopment. Now, vertical envelopment, this is a great write-up on Substack by Big Surge, or Surge Edge, as I've written here. Drop off that G. The world is still adjusting to the new kinetic logic of the powerful intelligence surveillance reconnaissance strike nexus, which now rules the battlefield. What Kursk demonstrates, however, is that conventional sensibilities about operations are hardly obsolete. If anything, they've become even more important in the age of the FPV drone. And this is where I say, drones have changed warfare, but it still hasn't changed conventional sensibilities about war. What it does is you've got powerful ISR and directed artillery and targeted artillery. That's the change here. That means your conventional sensibilities are not obsolete. They are more important. I agree 100%. Ukraine's defeat in Kursk ultimately reduces to well-established rules about lines of communication and flank security. The early advances in Kotonovo and Snagost left their western flank permanently crumbled and thrust them back on a thin logistical chain, which was easy for the Russian forces to surveil and strike. In a sense, drones have made it possible to vertically envelop enemy forces and isolate frontline groupings with persistent overwatch on supply roads. We will come back to that. This is why I said it was so important when the Russians first pushed on the eastern side of Pokrovsk. And it looks something like this. As I said, what they will focus to do is widen this, because what happens is, if it's not wide, you don't have many logistics routes, and you have a massive saturation of Ukrainian drones and artillery back into here, that it can get vertically enveloped. This is the biggest problem in Kursk, is it went deep, but it never went wide. And what have I been saying here? Out and widen, and that's what we have seen the command do. And now it's really met up with Toretsk. And this is the vertical envelopment of Pokrovsk that can take place. Remember, anything within 15 kilometres, we're hearing, is getting absolutely shattered by drones. And we see from the logistics routes here to the grey zone around here, around 13 kilometres. But of course, from areas into the centre, you can hit basically anywhere in here. And what the vertical envelopment can do is, your traditional envelopment is around like this, whether strategic or a physical envelopment. What a vertical envelopment can do is you don't need to physically move around or have even fire control from your arty. If you can just have strikes on all of these entry points in here, regardless of where they are, you are vertically enveloped. And it's enveloping this way more so than around. And movements in and out become impossible or hugely costly. And that hugely costly movements can be beneficial in attritional war for your enemy. This isolates frontline groupings with persistent overwatch on supply roads. This was a feature that was largely missing in Bakhmut, where the Russians were still preferentially using tube artillery rather, but it seems to be a permanent feature on the battlefield going forward, making seemingly antiquated concerns of lines of communication more important than ever. Drones matter, but the spatial positions of forces matter too. Again, a drone is another tool in the toolbox. There is no such thing as wonder weapons, just better, more sharp tools. Speak about this or back in Zaporizhia. In both cases, they were unable to cope with the capability of Russian strike systems to isolate their groupings on the front line. So we haven't seen Ukraine be able to vertically envelop something like this on the Russians, but we are seeing Kursk to down here, this vertical envelopment, and Vitaly, a pro-Ukraine blogger, saying, and we know this, that those drone pilots in Kursk, they've been moved down to Pokrovsk. But listen to this. The most disastrous direction is Dobropilia, where we're seeing that grey zone move out, hook around, and what we know is there are gaps in the defensive lines, where the Russians managed to grey out the road to Druzivka, threatening to disrupt logistics between Pokrovsk and Kramatorsk defensive hubs. And all of this movement is threatening these roads in and out all the way Dobropilia, Minograd, Pokrovsk, and all the way up into Kramatorsk, back down Konstantinivka and Toretsk. Look at the roads coming in out of Pokrovsk is very, very important. One, for Ukraine to hold, but secondly, if the Russians get it, to bring weapons and move out from there also. And this is a better one that I've shown you right in here. This movement right in here, that finger coming around, moving between defensive lines, a hole in that defensive line, cutting off some of the roads in here as well, while vertically enveloping these logistics routes in here. And day by day, that is getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. Meanwhile, these red lines show what could be a vertical envelopment. Vitaly continues. Seems like native fortifications were penetrated with little resistance, though no further advancement was made, suggesting some organisational adjustments in the area that managed to patch the breach, but failed to stop the overflow. And as I've been showing you in some footage, there are major reinforced fortifications with very little resistance in them. The grey zone must be cleared, and this is talking about these maps in here and that movement around Dobropilia, Druzivka area, or it will lead to serious problems in the future. Overall development is slow but confident. Lessons should be learned and mistakes avoided. It's unpleasant to follow, but losing is always hard. This is the thing. I won't share you news that just makes you happy. We have to talk about the unpleasant truths too. So far, the only available strategy is to inflict as much losses as possible while minimising our own. Changes are slow, but inevitable, as the armed forces of Ukraine are moving in the right direction, but maybe not that fast, but moving. Settlements can be restored, but people cannot. So to maintain and try and support the soldiers in here too, but as this moves around, it's becoming more and more difficult. The vertical envelopment of Pokrovsk and these roads through Dobropilia and other areas that will be affected as well. And there is a real threat that once Pokrovsk falls, it may fall very quickly, and it may move very quickly past it as well. And what we saw was this happen in areas like Avdiivka. But once Avdiivka fell, it fell for a long time following this. Same as Vuhledar. Remember Vuhledar? It took months and months and months of fighting in Vuhledar. Then we saw it fall, and then that free fall following that, now out to 56 kilometres behind that area. So keep an eye on this and what becomes of it, but Ukraine cannot risk losing massive amounts in here, especially out in these open fields. Pull back at the right time, which we have seen is not a strength of the Ukrainian forces, is to pull back early and preserve forces. It has not been a strength, and I have no confidence at all that that will change. So let's actually have a look on the map. So we get back on the 25th here. So yesterday we see Russia made more movement as per geolocations around Kamyansk and pushing on this area. This area does concern me, as it should have been very easy to defend. We haven't seen it move for some time. And then we see a little bit of ground being made around the Yamblanivki area, but still well behind the geolocations that we know. Those are the only changes on this map yesterday. And then we'll step up to today. Now, what everyone is focused on is this up in here, around Kendrikivka, that Ukraine has, by the blue check, made some ground back in here. And this is being heralded as a massive win. And I've said for some time that this map is behind or where Ukraine had successful advancements in here. But again, what is being said as a heralded as a huge victory and all this, Ukraine has taken back one minor area while 10 or 15 others have fallen. This is not changing the trajectory of the war. We need to still be realistic about the level of successes and wins. And this is showing more ground being made in a day than is realistically happened, because we have seen over the past week that Ukraine has made, or past couple of weeks, Ukraine has made small chipping advancements in here. And Ukraine has taken full control over the locality of Kendrikivka. So a success. But everyone will focus on this who has been completely ignoring all the other red all up and down the maps. So we can confirm that. Let's come into Kupiansk, where the island boys are hanging out. We know it doesn't look like that. We can see grey zone extension and red check around Radkivka, with Radkivka coming under control. And this should be a concern, because Kupiansk, by the grey zone here, is further getting enveloped and in around right onto the mid-west of this. That should be of great concern, given how important Kupiansk is. So let's have a look on this Syriac map in here. And realistically, this is how this will look. But the grey zone in here shows way further southwest than the red check on this is. The red on Syriac is showing realistically in line with the geolocation we've seen, and movement right into the entry on the northern aspect of Kupiansk. Keep an eye on this, because the amount of forces that Ukraine will need to send in to try and stabilise Pokrovsk, unless it becomes a catastrophic collapse all at once, will leave other areas exposed. And that is one of Russia's goals. They are numerically superior. They want to stretch you out. And people saying, oh, it's unfair, that's what you do in warfare. If Ukraine was numerically superior, we'd be saying they should do the same thing. Same as lengthening the front line or lengthening the time of the war. More red check around then Kurtamivka. This is on the northeast of Toretsk. Realistically, the grey zone, the red, is probably well past even a grey zone on this area. We see more ground being made, as we showed you in here, and some more around Velika Novosilka. This in here, Voskrenskia, all the way down to Perabuvda. This is definitely red at the moment. Probably fall into next month to not get that big spike month to month. Again, things play into optics as well. And then we'll come up into Terny on our last map. We see Zarashne and Toshke sitting down in here. And this interests me in here, as because Surek is saying the Russian army began an assault as it's south of the locality of Torske after crossing the forest area in Dobrova. So right down in here, as per we see this grey zone on Deep State, which was interesting at best, that there's more movement down in here. So we will see what becomes of this Torske front, Dobrova Forest, Terny front as a whole, because the Terny front can become an axis around Siversk, but also an axis towards Liman that will become in and around the back of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, the major areas left in the Donbass. So let's talk about our last folder here about US tariffs, Trump's tariffs. And we know Trump is saying he had a huge success with Australia buying American beef, or American beef being allowed into Australia. And what I'll say is that's probably the equivalent of sending instant coffee to Italy. Australia export already 70% of our beef, and I might be a little bit biased, but Australian beef, in my opinion, is much higher quality than American beef. It doesn't need to go on a boat. It's going to be cheaper. Anyway, I'm off in the woods. Reuters share this. Trump unlikely to enforce tariff threat on Russian oil. Trump is unlikely to follow through on his threat to place 100% tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil because it would worsen politically damaging inflation pressures, and his similar threat against buyers of Venezuelan oil has had limited success, especially in China. And what this leaves out is, as well, the incentivization of countries moving away from the USD because of the weaponized tariffs and sanctions, and US cannot afford pricks to do this. Trump said this month he would put 100% secondary tariffs on countries that buy Russian exports unless Moscow agrees to a major peace deal within 50 days. It expires early September. The threat mirrored an announcement in March the US would slap tariffs on buyers of sanctioned Venezuelan oil. No such tariffs have been imposed since. From this gentleman, the Director of Geopolitical Risk Service and Consultancy, has said, "We find that secondary tariffs may be too blunt of an instrument for the administration to use. If you're willing to go with the nuclear option, removing 4.5 million plus barrels a day out of the market, and you're willing to cut off commercial ties with other countries because they're importing Russian oil, you're going to risk a massive oil price spike and a meltdown of the global economy." And oil is just supply and demand, and Russia have a huge amount of supply, and demand for oil is always very high. And if you cut that off, what you're risking is other countries going, we're importing it anyway, or a huge then price spike. And for me, just being in the US, the cost of food, the cost of living has skyrocketed since I've been there. The only thing that isn't super high yet is fuel price, but this would shoot that up massively and be massively unpopular, let alone incentivizing other nations to continue buying it and move into their own independent sovereign currency. That if the 100% tariff is fully enforced on countries that receive Russian barrels, it has the potential to cut global supplies and drive prices higher. And he says, first, Trump, he's very sensitive to high oil prices and will want to avoid that outcome. What Russia may also be able to do is the opposite of this, is flood the world's market with much more oil and lower the price of oil, because Russia, Saudi, they produce oil far cheaper per barrel than America can. So America's profit margin is much, much lower and can have a huge effect on these oil companies in America then actually staying above water for a large amount of time. So there's all of this too. That's why there are restrictions and quotas on oil in OPEC, OPEC plus. Some US trade partner nations may, just like oil traders, dismiss this as grandstanding. 2 days after issuing the tariff threat, Trump said the oil price of $64 a barrel was a great level. From here, he has been extremely tough on Russian President Vladimir Putin from a White House spokesman, and smartly left out all options on the table while leaving existing sanctions in place, and recently threatened Putin with biting tariffs and sanctions if he does not agree to a ceasefire. Have a vote in the comments if you want. I think Putin read the 50-day thing and went, yeah, whatever. I don't think it's going to have a huge effect at all. Indian oil refineries, major buyers of Russian crude, do not believe that Trump will follow through on the threat, and there are no plans to stop purchases of Russian oil, 3 sources at Indian refiners said. And this is the thing. India's buying crude, refining it, and then selling it into countries like in the European Union. Based on the administration's apparent hesitancy to target Russia through trade sanctions, I do not see the Russian oil tariff as a threat as particularly effective from this gentleman here. Action is not likely to come from Congress, even though US Senate has strong bipartisan support for a bill that would impose 500% tariffs on buyers of Russian oil. Again, where this backfires is it shows BRICS nations, India and China, that, hey, if our countries do something the US doesn't like, they can just sanction us, from then rich people to companies to governments. We need to move away from this currency. That is where the catastrophic fallout may occur. Even if the bill passes, it will likely allow the president to waive tariffs, letting lawmakers claim they are tough on Russia but rendering the legislation mostly symbolic. Rhetoric, reality that we speak of a lot. But all of this This comes down to the seizing and stealing of Russian assets too, from private assets to government assets that are frozen in areas, and why I don't believe a lot of nations, if they're clever about it, won't just take that. One, using the money off the top that it produces is one thing. Using that itself, whether it is the cost of a super yacht to frozen gold or whatever, that's very different, because it can fully undermine the euro, the pound, the dollar as we step into more global markets. And I put myself in the shoes of a Chinese businessman or someone in the Chinese government, whatever, and I go, look, if China's going to make a move here, I can be sanctioned on this money. I'm not going to put my money in euros, pounds, or dollars. I'm going to sit it in Saudi or in the UAE or something else, or push on, hey, BRICS needs to move away from the weaponization of the dollar. And that's where America's power is. America's power is not in aircraft carriers. It's not in jets. It's not in Trump. It's in the USD. But that power has slowly been trickling away. And I don't think they want to hit, as I said yesterday, the turbo NOS buttons on that. Of course, the last thing Trump wants is people going to the Bowser and everything inflating, because people don't realise, I think, the butterfly effect of rising oil. Rising oil, it's not only putting in your car, but the truck that takes the food to the shop, that uses diesel, it uses petroleum, and that will skyrocket, and then food gets more expensive and flows all the way down. And food in America is absurdly expensive, is unbelievable. I don't think Americans realise how ripped off they're getting with food for the quality versus the money. Anyway, legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.